Can your employer force you to have the coronavirus vaccine? I'm Daniel Barnett, a barrister in England and Wales, and in this video we're going to be discussing three things. The choices that might be presented to you: get vaccinated or get dismissed. The cold, hard reality facing you if your employer instructs you to be vaccinated, and what sort of claims you'll have if you're dismissed following opting not to get vaccinated and being dismissed as a result. You can also watch my video on can the government compel you to have the coronavirus vaccine. Just to be clear, this video is about whether your employer can dismiss you if you refuse to have the vaccine. I've recorded a separate video on whether the government can compel you to have it, whether it can impose mandatory vaccination on you, and you can watch that video on this YouTube channel. Now, this sounds obvious, but it does need saying. An employer can't compel you to get vaccinated in the sense that it can't pin you down to the floor, kneel on you, stab a needle in your arm and press the plunger. Of course, an employer cannot force you to get vaccinated in that sense. The sort of choice you're likely to face is the employer coming to you and saying, if you don't get vaccinated, we're going to dismiss you. And they'll give you lots of opportunities and they'll talk to you a lot about it first, but ultimately it comes down to a hard, final, binary choice for you. Do you agree to get vaccinated or do you get dismissed? So can your employer say, if you don't get vaccinated, we're going to dismiss you? Before I give you the answer, there's just one other point that I want to make clear. Although it might be unlawful for your employer to dismiss you in certain circumstances, that doesn't mean they can't. They can dismiss you. The dismissal will be effective. You'll have no money coming in unless you get another job. You can then go and bring an employment tribunal claim, and 12 months later you might get compensation. But there's absolutely nothing that an employee can ever do, save in the rarest circumstances, which almost certainly aren't going to arise here, to stop themselves being actually dismissed, as long as they're paid their notice pay. So the short answer to the question is that your employer may be able to dismiss you if you don't agree to a vaccination. It's just that you might be able to sue them afterwards and get compensation. So will you have any claims if you're dismissed for refusing a vaccine? Well, I think there are three things to think about here. Number one, vaccine hesitancy is not a protected characteristic like sex, race, age, disability. They're all protected characteristics, and under the Equality Act, an employer can't treat you less favourably or dismiss you because of those protected characteristics. But vaccine hesitancy, the reluctance to be vaccinated, is not a protected characteristic. A disabled person might be able to mount an argument that vaccinating them is dangerous because of their disability, and so dismissing them because of their refusal to be vaccinated is dismissing them for a reason associated with their disability. But that would require a quite unusual and quite specific set of facts to bring that claim, and it's not going to be the case for the overwhelming majority of people. A Muslim employee might be able to argue that dismissal for refusing the injection discriminates against them because the vaccine contains pork, gelatine, and so offends the laws of halal and discriminates indirectly on grounds of disability. I don't actually know whether the Pfizer or the other vaccines contain pork gelatin. I have tried to find out. I couldn't find that information anywhere. But if they do, that argument is theoretically open to a Muslim employee. But with both the disability discrimination claim and the religious discrimination claim, the employer is still going to be able to justify that discrimination if it can show it has a good reason for requiring the whole workforce to get vaccinated. And there are lots of really complex factors here that come in on which, if you were running this argument, you'd need to get specific legal advice. So that's the first point. You're unlikely to have any sort of discrimination claim. What about unfair dismissal? Well, the second point is that unfair dismissal rights only bite if you've worked for more than 2 years. So if you've worked for less than 2 years, if you've got less than 2 years continuity of employment, you just won't have an unfair dismissal claim. There are a few exceptions to the 2-year rule, for example, in whistleblowing dismissals, but this isn't really going to fit into any of those exceptions. If you haven't got 2 years employment, you can't bring an unfair dismissal claim, which unfortunately means there is nothing you can do legally if you're dismissed because your employer said, have the vaccine or we'll dismiss you. So that's the second point. If you've got less than 2 years service, you really don't have a claim, I'm afraid. If you weren't paid your notice when you were dismissed, you'd have a claim for that, but that's really the size of it. Number 3, if you have worked for more than 2 years, then you'd have an unfair dismissal claim open to you. And you'd be arguing that the employer's decision to dismiss you for refusing to take the vaccine is unreasonable in all the circumstances. Now, it's going to take a year before this is tested in the tribunals because it takes about a year for cases to get to tribunal. And obviously, at the date of recording this, December 2020, we haven't had any vaccines yet, or indeed any people refusing to take the vaccines at work because the vaccine isn't yet on general release. But by the time the vaccine gets into the general population, as we make our way through 2021, and people are dismissed for refusing to take it, and we're getting into the end of 2021 and 2022, at that point we'll start to get some court decisions coming through. But for now, I think the unfair dismissal claim is actually quite a strong argument. I think it's quite compelling to argue that the employer has acted unreasonably in dismissing somebody for refusing the vaccine because of a combination of 4 factors. First of all, one's got to remember the point that employers just can't compel vaccination, in the sense they can't legally insist and get an injunction to require somebody to be vaccinated. So if you can't compel somebody to do something that is intrusive into their bodily integrity, it would be bizarre if that could be enforced by the back route, by the back door, by being allowed to dismiss somebody as a result of refusing to consent. That's not the best argument, but it's the starting point for the next 3 arguments, which are better. Second of all, it's almost certainly an interference with the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights. Article 8 says everybody has a right to respect for their private life. Now, injecting somebody with a vaccine, on the face of it, breaches that respect for private life. It breaches your bodily integrity. And tribunals are not going to be impressed by employers who say, well, we have to make somebody breach their bodily integrity, we have to interfere with private life because we really, really want it. Number 3, a small but significant proportion of the population does have real concerns about the side effects of the vaccination and about the fact they believe it hasn't been tested as thoroughly as it should have been. Now, I don't share those views. I'm going to be first in queue to get the jab when my sleeve is rolled up and I get the opportunity, but there is nevertheless a small proportion of the workforce that genuinely and reasonably has those concerns. And a tribunal isn't going to like employers dismissing people for refusing to have injections when they reasonably believe those injections could be dangerous. And number 4, linked to that, a tiny proportion of the population may have adverse reactions to the vaccination. We cannot rule out some people will have side effects. Now, the medical evidence is quite clear. The benefits to the population of having the vaccination outweighs the risk of harm to the population as a whole. But of course, an individual could have severe side effects, theoretically. We don't know yet, but theoretically. And so it's going to be very hard for a tribunal to say that the employer is acting reasonably in dismissing for a refusal to have that vaccination and risk potential bodily harm, even if the risk is believed to be very, very low. So I think an unfair dismissal claim would have a decent chance of winning if you're dismissed because of a refusal to take the vaccination. Now, of course, you'll be out of a job by then. You'll have been unemployed for a year or so, which is the amount of time it takes to get a tribunal case to court. And the maximum a tribunal can award is 1 year's pay for this sort of unfair dismissal claim. So you're not going to be getting rich at the end of it. You'll get up to a year's salary, and it will take the best part of a year to get there. And unless you get a new job pretty quickly, you're going to have suffered a very, very difficult economic time while unemployed because you refused to take the vaccine. So the litigation route is not an ideal answer to the problem. It's not giving you an enormous shield to the employer who says, take the vaccination or be dismissed. Because you can still be dismissed. Yes, you might get compensation a year down the line, but it's not going to protect you and help you during that year that you're unemployed. Now, there is an exception to my views on what I've just said. I do think that organisations like the NHS, organisations like care homes, are going to be in a much stronger position to justify dismissal of somebody who's refused to have the vaccination. Because in those organisations, it's mission critical to make sure that the workforce is immunised and to make sure that the workforce isn't passing the infection on to residents of care homes, to patients within the NHS, etc. It's much more mission critical to make sure that everybody is vaccinated. So I think those sorts of employers would be in much stronger positions to win an unfair dismissal claim if you brought one against them having been dismissed. They would need to show they tried to redeploy you to a non-front line role where it wouldn't matter so much if you were vaccinated. But as long as they could show they tried to redeploy you, there was nothing available, or you'd refused redeployment, I think an NHS trust, a care home, a similar organisation would have a strong defence to an unfair dismissal claim for dismissing you for refusing a vaccination. I also just want to mention the position of anti-vaxxers. Now, there's a big difference between an anti-vaxxer and someone who is vaccine hesitant. The vaccine hesitant person is anxious, is nervous, maybe put off the thought of a vaccine because of the uncertainty surrounding it. The anti-vaxxers are more strident and more militant in their objection, not only to themselves having the vaccine, but to others as well. So if an employer employs an evangelical anti-vaxxer, someone who's shouting from the rooftop, shouting in social media, going on interviews and saying, don't get vaccinated, it's unwise, it's dangerous, it carries risks, maybe the government's trying to implant some bizarre sort of chip into you. If the NHS or a similar organisations, or possibly even any public sector or well-regarded public-facing private sector employer employs an evangelical anti-vaxxer, I think that employer will be in a much stronger position to say, we're not continuing to employ you because your anti-vax message is inconsistent with our organisation's values. But short of that, I think most employees from most organisations who are dismissed for refusing to have the COVID vaccination would have a decent unfair dismissal claim. If you'd like to know a little bit more about how you bring an unfair dismissal claim in an employment tribunal, there's lots of good websites that can help you, and I've put links to a few of them in the notes below. But one I'd particularly recommend as a starting point is the ACAS website. That's www.acas.org.uk/dismissals. If you found this video helpful, please do have a look at my other video, Can the Government, not Employers, can the government compel you to have the coronavirus vaccine? Please do think about subscribing to the channel, click the notification bell to find out whenever I post a new explainer video on UK law. And if you've got any questions or comments, pop them in the comment box below. I do read every single comment that people post. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett. Bye bye.